love for the reluctant Duchess.
Written by Fanny Finch and published by Starfall Publications.
Save more with our offers and bundles on our website, starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. Bye, Papa. Be safe, Thea Caulfield called after her father, having given him a soft kiss on the cheek as his farewell. He was on his way to a meeting that he was certain would prove fruitful. The morning was cool, and a slight breeze wafted through the door as her father exited. Thea watched him go, aware that he was always hoping for fruitful meetings, always doing his best to trade with the wealthy, with the nobility. As a merchant, a man without a title, he had to work harder for his reputation, but Thea was proud of him for having done so well for himself. He had truly proven his mettle and was constantly making his way up. For a merchant, he was surprisingly respected in the community and had a good name for providing quality materials. Additionally, he sold them at a price that managed to show the quality without that stench of thievery that reeked upon the wares of so many merchants out there. Of course, those merchants were desperate to sell products for more than they were worth. But still, despite his reputation, their home showed little of his hard work. They were making it well enough, but remained people of no large wealth. And yet, Thea was proud of him, and proud to know that she would always be at home to care for him. "Did Papa leave already?" her sister Delia asked, coming up behind her. "Yes," Thea replied with a hopeful sigh. "I didn't have a chance to wish him luck," Delia complained. He knows we are all hoping for his success today," Thea reminded her. "He doesn't have to hear it to know it is true." "Still, I would have liked to kiss him on the cheek and give him a hug," Delia said. In reply, Thea put her own arm around her sister's shoulders. Delia was only 2 years younger than Thea, with hopes and dreams of her own. The two were fairly close, but Thea knew that Delia's goals would take her away from them all. "Any news from the man you had written to about finding work as a governess?" Thea asked, as she heard the sound of Georgette complaining at their mother for telling her that it was time to start her lessons. "Not yet. Perhaps I should write to another. I truly thought that by now he would have found me a position. If I cannot teach, then what am I to do with my life?" Delia asked, the notes of sadness in her voice seeming desperate. Thea gave her a wan smile. "You could always stay here with me and find work nearby and look after Papa," she reminded her. "I shall leave that to you and Mother," Delia replied with a gentle warning in her voice. "I know, but the little ones, you could teach them," Thea added, referencing their 3 youngest siblings. "Really? Now, Thea, Mother teaches Georgette as she taught you and me, and the boys are at their boarding school in Brighton. Who exactly am I to teach?" Delia prodded defensively. Thea gave up, knowing the argument was of no use. "I suppose you are right." Delia turned to her, reflecting the same green eyes and similar nose, but with a far lighter shade of brown in her hair, and a smaller mouth. It was clear that the two were sisters. "Georgette and Christopher are nearly 16. While he is off and away at school, Georgette has you and me to show her what is possible with her life. Do you not wish for more than simply staying at home, being a burden on Mother and Father until Papa is no more, and Thomas has to take us in? He is nearly finished with his schooling and fancies himself to be more than a merchant's son. Even if he does become a tradesman, does that mean he can support all of us?" Delia asked sensibly. "You know I'm right. Father does not need 3 of us and Mother to take care of him here in this home when he is old. And Georgette has the same prospects for marriage that you and I have, seeing as how we have no single male relatives of an appropriate age. So she can stay here hoping to be useful along with you and Mother, or she can consider that perhaps she can work and provide for herself." Thea was quiet. She knew that Delia was right. Thomas, a year younger than Delia, was on his way to university within the year. Most likely, Christopher would not be able to attend unless the family's fortunes took a turn for the better. And unless the girls somehow managed to find husbands, the possibility of becoming burdens to their brothers was looking more and more likely. "I suppose you are right, but it does not mean that I should like to consider it. Can you not teach somewhere closer? Why must you go all the way to London? It is such an awful place. Wouldn't you rather be in a place where you could breathe fresh air, Delia? Thea urged, inciting her sister to remain. Of course I shall miss fresh air, but I am needed in London. There are children there living on the streets, and there are benefactors of church-run schooling programs for them. Why should I not teach those children who have even less than we? Delia pointed out. Thea was exhausted from arguing when she knew her sister's self-righteous reasons were entirely justified. Could she debate when her sister lived a life of charity and grace? Additionally, there was no one living nearby seeking a governess, which defeated the whole purpose. Perhaps it was merely her own frustration that she had no hopes for herself. She truly would grow to become a burden. Her father who worked so hard, and her mother who was already taking care of him. What did they need Thea for? I suppose you're right. And you are not alone. I know I ought to be looking for work as well, Thea conceded. She loved being with her family and would be sad to leave them, but she also knew that it was time to be off and begin her future. Well, clearly it is taking time. You shall have me for a good deal longer, it would seem. Perhaps you will find work before me, Delia replied, wrapping her arm around Thea's and resting her head on her sister's shoulder. They continued to watch out the open door, seeing their father grow smaller and smaller by the moment. Thea hoped that this meeting would truly be the one to change all their fortunes. Chapter 2. Finishing his breakfast, Joseph Tyndale, the Duke of Sandon, excused himself and stood slowly, nodding to his mother. "And where are you off to in such a hurry?" she inquired. "I have a meeting, Mother, about the new property. It must be furnished if we are to have guests or even stay there ourselves, don't you think?" he pointed out. "So, are you meeting with someone regarding the home?" she pressed. "Yes, Mother. The Duke of Arbershire arranged it for me. There is a gentleman who works with nobility to arrange their homes," he explained, showing slight frustration at his mother's nagging. "A gentleman?" she said, needing to question him further. "A merchant, Mother. He is a merchant. He sells fabrics. I will choose those which I want for my new property. For curtains, for bedding, for the cushions on the chairs of the dining room set. All of it. He has contacts with whom everything will be designed and produced. Mother," the Duke of Sandon replied, trying to restrain himself from yelling. He had grown tired of her insistence upon questioning him. The Duke of Sandon had tried to remain a good son. He had done everything she wanted from him. And yet she was never happy, primarily because of a decision he had yet to make. "You know, if you were married, your wife would take care of all of these things, and you would be able to focus on far more important things, Joseph," she said, finally expressing what she had really meant to say from the beginning of the conversation. "Yes, Mother, I know this." He spoke slowly and deliberately, gritting his teeth with each word. "I only mean to remind you that this is the duty of a wife, not a duke. And if you were married—" "I know, Mother, and I am sorry for not having found a wife yet. But I do keep quite busy, and I am generally in circles visited merely by men," he reminded her. "Oh, but there are some lovely balls in London during the season. Why have you not made more of an effort?" she whined. The Duke of Sandon sighed. "Mother, if it should please you, then in 3 weeks' time, when the season begins, I shall attend every ball which I am able," he assured her. "That's my boy," she replied with a patronizing smile. The Duke of Sandon sighed again and made his way out of his mother's dining room. As he left the house, he grabbed his hat and his favourite coat for business meetings. The driver opened the door to the coach, and the Duke of Sandon got in. The ride to his new estate just outside of Cambridge was longer than he would have liked, but knew that the man he was going to meet would likely have a less comfortable ride getting there. However, upon arrival, he found that Mr. Caulfield was already at the estate and seemed not in the least bit inconvenienced, despite having travelled with a large portfolio of samples and drawings of potential furniture designs. "Mr. Caulfield, I thank you for meeting with me," the Duke of Sandon greeted. "Your Grace," Mr. Caulfield replied with a bow to the Duke. "Please do come in. We have a few chairs upon which we may sit," the Duke of Sandon said with a slight laugh. The staff at the nearly empty home welcomed the two men and prepared tea for them at a large dining room table with 6 chairs, one of the only pieces of furniture in the whole house. "Well, we do have our work cut out for us, do we not?" Mr. Caulfield said in good humour. "Indeed, Mr. Caulfield, it would seem that we do. I think, however, that based upon my friend, the Duke of Arbishire's recommendation of you, we shall have it all come together in due course," the Duke of Sandon said, readily. "Well, I am humbled by the Duke of Arbishire's praise. He is an excellent man." "How did the two of you become acquainted, might I inquire?" Mr. Caulfield asked, taking a sip of the hot tea. "We both attended Cambridge University and our first meeting was there, but our friendship continued over a shared love of fencing," the Duke replied. "And how is it that the Duke of Arbishire came to acquire your talents, Mr. Caulfield?" "Oh, the general way, the same as I have come to you. One happy customer begets another, I suppose," Mr. Caulfield answered. Polite conversation continued, but soon the teacups were empty. The Duke of Sandon perceived Mr. Caulfield was too kind to waste his time in accepting a third, so they got down to business. "What I have here are the samples, and these are designs, broken into sections such as bedroom, parlour, etc. Now for the fabrics. Are you thinking brocades or solids throughout?" he inquired. The Duke of Sandon was at a loss, overwhelmed by having to make these types of decisions. He ought to have simply hired someone, but knowing his mother, it wouldn't have done. Her taste was so specific that the Duke of Sandon knew any hired person could not quite handle the woman's distaste as he might be able to. And the thought of asking her to choose was unreasonable, as she would then simply blame him for not having a wife to do it herself. "Mr. Caulfield, I fear that I am ill-equipped for this. I do think that brocades might do better as a theme throughout the home, but I cannot imagine it would be comfortable for the bedding," he thought out loud. He perceived that Mr. Caulfield did not wish to insult him, and the man was proceeding carefully. "That is of no concern, Your Grace. We have entirely different options for fabrics of a more comfortable nature, primarily cottons," he explained politely. The Duke of Sandon nodded. Finally, they had narrowed down the selection to 3 brocades that the Duke of Sandon thought his mother would approve of before they moved on to satins. The Duke of Sandon was still overwhelmed and wished he didn't have to do all of this on his own. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but what do you think your wife will think of these options? Will the Duchess approve?" Mr. Caulfield inquired hopefully. The Duke of Sandon could see that what he really wanted to know was whether the mistress of the house would recommend him to her fashionable, high-status friends. "Indeed, Mr. Caulfield, I am not yet married, so thus far the only Duchess who shall be seeing this home and require approval is my mother, and, to be sure, she approves of very little," the Duke of Sandon said with a laugh. "Having said that, while her tastes are rather distinguished, the quality of your materials speaks for itself, and I imagine she will speak highly of you to those willing to listen." Mr. Caulfield seemed pacified for the most part, but he did then say something for which the Duke of Sandon could not have been prepared. "Your Grace, I understand that I am but a humble merchant. I know well that it is not the custom of great men such as yourself to engage with simple merchants in fashionable society. However, it would be a great delight to me if you would concede to dine at the home of a man so far below your station as myself," Mr. Caulfield invited, bowing his head slightly and closing his eyes in reverence, hiding his mischievous grin. The Duke of Sandon was both intrigued and astonished, for merchants never had the gall to invite a duke to their homes. And perhaps that very courage was what endeared Mr. Caulfield to the Duke of Sandon so intensely. He smiled at the man whose head was still bowed. "Mr. Caulfield, I should enjoy that very much," the Duke of Sandon replied. Chapter 3. "Yes, but he is a duke," Georgette pointed out for what seemed to be the 100th time. "Then you go prance about and show off if you would like to, but I have no interest. He is father's business acquaintance and nothing more," Thea urged. Besides, you are aware, are you not, that dukes are often old men? You truly think so? If he were an old man, do you really think that he would still be single? Georgette urged with a giggle. If he is hideous and atrocious, then yes, Delia replied, entering the room and putting small silver bobs in her ears. It had been a time-honoured tradition in their home that for each of the 3 daughters, their father had saved to purchase them a pair of silver dot earrings for their 16th birthdays. Thea noted how Georgette, still 3 months away from 16, eyed them with envy. She tried to ignore her sister's pettiness. Delia tried to refrain from laughing, but her sister's look was too amusing. "Oh dear, she's coming," Delia said, glancing at the door. The sound of their mother's footsteps was drawing close, and soon she filled the doorway with her voluptuous figure. "Mother, what is it?" Thea asked, giving Mrs. Caulfield a chance to catch her breath. "Your father said he should be arriving within the hour, and I've not finished setting the table. Georgette, you must come with me," she instructed. "But Mother, I'm not yet ready. I've not finished my hair or pinched my cheeks, and I have yet to find a better dress for the evening," she complained. "And yet I asked you to help me anyway, child. Your sisters need to prepare themselves. They just do," Mrs. Caulfield ordered, leaving out the unspoken reason for the evening's visit. Thea knew well the true purpose of the dinner party. Her family hoped to present their 2 eldest daughters before a duke. What foolishness! What could possibly cause her parents to believe that a duke would be willing to risk the scandal of marriage to a merchant's daughter? She and Delia gave each other knowing looks, full of awareness that their mother was a fool and had clearly convinced herself of an impossible objective. Nevertheless, it was exciting to have an occasion for dressing up and making themselves appear presentable for society with their nicest dresses and hairstyles on which they rarely had reason to spend time. It was, indeed, a short time before they were alerted to the sound of a coach coming upon their home. Thea rushed to the window to catch a glimpse before following Delia to the door where they all pushed out and waited to greet the Duke. The coachman stepped down from his spot of driving the horses and nodded to the family who waited patiently. Then he opened the door to the coach, and all the Caulfields seemed to hold their breath. A head of medium brown hair gave way to a handsome face. Thea noted the brown eyes under strong brows, brows that could easily appear as stern if the situation warranted it. But as the Duke settled his feet upon the ground, he seemed to look about his surroundings awkwardly, as if confused as to how he should wind up in such a humble dwelling. He then noted that his fine leather shoes had struck up a bit of dust when they hit the ground, and that dust had settled finely on the surface of the black polish. Thea saw his attempts to hide his dismay, and the Duke prodded forward with apparent determination. He would not allow the inconvenience of dirt to cause any further delay in getting this meeting over with. "Mr. Caulfield, what a delight it is to see you again," the Duke of Sandon greeted with a charming smile. Thea held back a scoff. This strong, wealthy, titled man clearly had no desire to spend time with her humble family. But she did have to give him credit for trying. It was rare to find a member of nobility willing to put aside the reluctance of associating with common folk and entertain the thought of a dinner. Arrogant though he may be, at least he was willing to move forward with this. "Your Grace, it is our honour, to be sure," Mr. Caulfield greeted in reply. "This is my wife, Mrs. Caulfield." Mrs. Caulfield shook the Duke's hand as if she were meeting the king himself. Wide-eyed and anxious, she spluttered out a simple greeting. "And my daughters. This is my eldest, Miss Caulfield. The next is her sister, Miss Delia, and our youngest daughter, Miss Georgette. My sons, Mr. Thomas Caulfield, and Miss Georgette's twin, Mr. Christopher Caulfield, are both away at school," Mr. Caulfield added with pride. For a man like him to manage affording school for his sons was evidence of his thrift and hard work. "Well, Mr. Caulfield, I am rather impressed by your beautiful family, and I do hope to meet your sons at some point," the Duke of Sandon added, politely, as he would with any member of London's nobility. Thea tried not to roll her eyes at his attempts to charm them and pretend they were equals. He was trying too hard, to be sure. What kind of hypocrite would try that hard to push aside their differences for the sake of appearance? "Well, of course, Your Grace," Mr. Caulfield replied enthusiastically, as if he believed it would ever happen in reality. Thea and Delia shared a quick glance in humour of their father's gullibility. To Thea, it was further evidence that she needed to stay and care for the poor old man with all of his silly assumptions about the world. The reality of the Duke making any effort to meet their brothers was laughable. Mr. Caulfield ushered the Duke inside along with his family. Thea wondered what the noble Duke must be thinking upon seeing the inside of their home with the clutter cramped inside the small quarters. "Humble dwellings, to be sure," her father laughed with embarrassment, but the Duke smiled kindly. "Mr. Caulfield, all I see is a man of excellent taste, a man I can trust to furnish my home, for I can see how he cares for his own." Thea was taken aback by the sentiment and could see that her father was greatly honoured by such a compliment. He tried not to stutter in his thanks. It was not long before her mother, Mrs. Caulfield, ushered everyone around the table and, dish by dish, brought food to the table with Georgette's assistance. "Miss Georgette, it is very kind of you to help your mother," the Duke of Sandon noted, causing Georgette to blush. "We do raise all our daughters to be hard workers. This evening, Georgette has been my helper, but all of our girls are excellent, accomplished young ladies who are eager to work hard on behalf of the household," Mrs. Caulfield commented in a rush. Thea felt the Duke of Sandon's eyes land on her for a moment, and her smile at her mother's obvious intentions fell into wide-eyed surprise. "I see. That is a fine quality," the Duke of Sandon said, his eyes remaining on Thea. Feeling the blood rush to her cheeks, Thea waited until the Duke of Sandon's gaze was elsewhere before she looked back up, having focused very intently on the empty plate before her. When she raised her eyes, they met Delia's. Thea saw then that her sister was watching her with a combination of mocking jealousy and eager encouragement. She wasn't sure exactly how she ought to interpret that. "Yes, a fine quality. Now, Your Grace, do you prefer pheasant or chicken?" Mrs. Caulfield asked, ready to fill his plate. "My goodness, what fine offerings you have, madam. I beg you to please choose for me. As your husband must have noted while working together, I am a poor man for decision-making," the Duke of Sandon joked. "Well then, I have just the thing," Mrs. Caulfield exclaimed, cutting a bit of each bird and placing it on the Duke's plate. Thea noted that it would be apparent to any man of any form of nobility that the dinner had cost a small fortune for a family like hers. Her family had clearly gone above and beyond their means and were trying to impress him. She ought to be embarrassed, but rather hoped that the Duke would be appreciative. Not that men in his position ever were appreciative of much. Soon, all plates were full, with Mrs. Caulfield deciding which bird landed on which plate to ensure that there was enough of each for the Duke to have seconds. There were also boiled potatoes, cabbage, green beans, and apparently anything else their mother decided to uproot from the garden. The meal began, and it was not long before the anticipated questions began. "I was shocked to learn that you are not married, Your Grace. Surely any woman would make a fortunate wife of yours," Mrs. Caulfield said slyly. All read through her words easily, knowing that the Duke would make an ideal husband for a family with so little means. The Duke of Sandon smiled, and Thea read in it that he too understood. "Indeed, Mrs. Caulfield, I should be most fortunate to find a wife of grace, charm, and attention to her work," he replied, referencing her remarks earlier about her own daughters. Thea was furious at this. He was mocking their mother, who would take his words to heart, who would believe that he truly thought her children suitable for marriage. It seemed cruel and spiteful to take advantage of their hospitality and play this horrible joke. What work ethic might be required of the wife of a duke? Thea asked, a furrow between her brows to show the Duke of Sandon that she understood the undertone of mocking in his voice. After all, other than spending her husband's money, surely there is no real work that cannot be executed by the staff of the nobleman's home. The Duke of Sandon clearly read Thea's accusation and seemed taken aback by it. He did not show an obvious offence, but the surprise was enough. Although Thea knew her mother did not grasp the exchange or the teasing from the Duke of Sandon's previous remark, she worried that her parents would be angry at her for upsetting the dinner. Thea simply looked back to her plate and resumed eating, aware that she would not have such a meal for a long time to come. As time passed, Thea and Delia sat quietly, as patiently as was proper. They made no show of interest in the Duke and did not fall over themselves to flatter him as their parents would have liked. Georgette made a few attempts to be noticed, but Thea saw that the Duke was not swayed by her youth or beauty. After all, what could ever draw the attention of a Duke to a simple merchant's daughter? Chapter 4. Forgive me, Your Grace, there was a bit of flooding on the route, Mr. Caulfield apologised, rushing into the estate and handing his hat and jacket to one of the housekeepers with a kind smile and a nod of the head. He had finally arrived at the Duke of Sandon's new estate. No need to apologise, Mr. Caulfield, the Duke of Sandon replied. I myself was delayed and only just arrived. The Duke of Sandon led Mr. Caulfield into the dining area again, and they seated themselves once more at the large table for tea. As it had been cold outside, the tea was particularly satisfying, and the Duke of Sandon insisted that Mr. Caulfield enjoy as much as he liked. He had been appreciative of the generous hospitality he had received at the Caulfields' home 3 evenings before, and wished to return it. The dinner with Mr. Caulfield's family had been unexpected. While he knew that he would be visiting an area he had previously had no reason to tread, there was something about seeing this man's dwelling that had increased his respect for him. Mr. Caulfield was clearly a man of intelligence and hard work to be making a name for himself among nobility, but it seemed that he still had no wealth to show for it. This would be a large order he would place with the merchant, and the Duke of Sandon was certain that he could find others who might be in need of Mr. Caulfield's assistance. He had even mentioned the man to his mother that morning, but this only resulted in another lecture. She believed it was unnatural for a man to be choosing these designs for his home when he ought to have a wife doing the job for him. This, of course, sparked a furious debate between mother and son about the Duke of Sandon's need to marry quickly. At this point, he reminded her that London's season would not be starting for another 2.5 weeks. This seemed to appease her briefly, but she had ended the conversation with a demand that the Duke of Sandon find a wife within the first week. The Duke of Sandon shook the conversation from his thoughts and focused on the work at hand, choosing. Oh yes, his greatest challenge in life was simply the idea of making a choice. Mr. Caulfield then showed the Duke of Sandon a drawing for a bed design. This is Thea's favourite, he added. She is a young woman of exquisite taste, to be sure. Yes, yes, it is lovely, the Duke of Sandon replied, willing to accept any help he could get. He thought for a moment about Mr. Caulfield's eldest daughter. She had seemed terribly haughty. She was certainly the sort of girl which at first appears clever, but then shows it all to be a mere game for attention, like a commoner desiring a king and playing disinterest in hopes of driving him mad for her. The Duke of Sandon had seen young women like that many times. He would never fall for it or be swayed by it. In fact, he felt fairly certain that the Duke of Arbyshire's wife had been just such a young woman, showing disinterest first until William wanted her more than anything, and then proving herself to be quite worthless. That is, she was worthless at anything other than buying gowns with his money. The Duke of Sandon had learned that the majority of women sought only to raise their fortunes as opposed to raising a family. It was, however, a shame that such behaviour was wasted on a young woman so beautiful as she. Of course, it was always beautiful young women who believed their looks to be the only thing needed to find a husband. So, you agree with her taste? Mr. Caulfield prodded, breaking the Duke of Sandon from his thoughts. Yes, indeed, Mr. Caulfield. She has lovely taste, he said. That is good. She is a lovely girl. I have no doubt she will soon be swept away from me. Beautiful as she is, I fear that she might end up with a man who does not appreciate how clever and kind she also is, Mr. Caulfield added. She loves to read, she has a heart to help, and I think the only thing stopping her from seeking a suitor is to ensure that I am looked after. Yes, well, that is very nice of her, Mr. Caulfield, the Duke of Sandon agreed, trying to appease the man. But I must ask myself what prospects she could have. She is a young woman of beauty and wit, a woman of taste and class. But she is the daughter of a mere merchant with little to show for his work. Oh, her prospects do seem dim, do they not, Your Grace? Mr. Caulfield asked again. The Duke of Sandon knew what the merchant was trying to learn, and although he knew it was unwise, he could not stop himself from allowing the line of questioning to continue. After all, it was true that Mr. Caulfield was a good man and that Thea's prospects for a husband were small for the unfair reasoning of her father's position in the world. It was all true. And despite himself, he replied to the desperate man, I do not think they are so dim as you imagine, Mr. Caulfield. As you say, Miss Caulfield is a beautiful young woman, and you yourself have acknowledged that you are quite involved with men of nobility, the Duke of Sandon encouraged. Well, yes, but a noble marriage to my daughter, it is scandalous, Mr. Caulfield stated. The Duke sensed that Mr. Caulfield was digging for something. The Duke of Sandon saw it in his eyes. Mr. Caulfield knew that it would be a scandal, but he was begging the Duke of Sandon to consider it anyway. Begging him to deny the truth, to claim that it was, in fact, a good idea. Society has its own rules, the Duke of Sandon began slowly. But what a man chooses to do and what a woman agrees to is something else entirely.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
The words on his tongue felt thick and heavy, but even as he said them, the Duke of Sandon had a realization. He needed to marry. Miss Caulfield was beautiful with her long, dark curls, deep green eyes and full mouth. Certainly, there had been nothing that passed between them to spark an affection, but her father desired the match. What's more, the Duke of Sandon would indeed cause a scandal. And his mother, who had urged him into marriage and had spent her days tormenting him relentlessly about it, would get exactly the opposite of her wish even as he fulfilled it. But could he truly do this? Could he marry this young woman out of spite for his mother? The Duke of Sandon wanted to think himself a better man than that. Yes, he could reframe the decision. It was not out of spite to his mother. It was out of charity to Mr. Caulfield. Isn't this what the merchant wanted? Wouldn't his family be provided for if he agreed to marry the man's daughter? Wouldn't they find a whole new station in life if he granted them this? A wife named Thea Caulfield, this graceful, elegant woman who probably had none of the manners to match her appearance. Could she become a duchess? Why not? Mr. Caulfield, he said once more, beginning slowly, might I ask you to be forthright with me about your wishes? I do believe that I am interpreting them correctly, but I should feel a fool if I am mistaken and choose to speak out of turn. Mr. Caulfield appeared suddenly very nervous, as if wondering himself why he had dared to start this line of conversation, which could so possibly lead to an embarrassment that he had not intended. Your Grace, I do hold you in the highest esteem, Mr. Caulfield said, before allowing a pause. And as you are a man who is kind and great in your status, you must know that a father would wish the best for his daughters. I can offer them very little. I can offer them only what I glean from my hard work. But you, Your Grace, you could offer a young woman anything in this world. Do you believe my eldest daughter, Miss Thea, or even my next eldest, Miss Delia, to be worthy of your great attentions? If so, I should be very honoured for you to consider a match of marriage, Your Grace. A long pause held, in which the Duke of Sandon considered the extent of the merchant's request. Yes, this was a man who was unafraid to ask for whatever he desired. To have a duke dine with him, to have a duke marry his daughter. It took a very special sort of man to ask for these things, and the Duke of Sandon could not help but respect him for it. To be clear, Mr. Caulfield, allow me to first tell you that I greatly respect your mettle, he said, with genuine alacrity. I have never heard of such a request. Please understand that I mean no condescension when I say this, but your request is not one that occurs between our differing stations. Again, I understand the harshness of that, and please know that I mean no insult by it. Understood, Mr. Caulfield replied, accepting the truth of it. But the fact that you are willing to make such a request anyway shows me how diligently you serve your family, Mr. Caulfield. I am reminded that you are a unique man, to be certain, and I must also tell you that I did, of course, notice the beauty of your daughters. While I think they thought very little of me, I could not, of course, help notice them. I do not know if it would be an adequate match. I do not know if either of them would have any desire at all to be my wife, or if I should be happy to marry among your daughters. However, I also am well aware that I must marry soon if I'm to appease my mother and those around me, urging me to find a wife. Is that so, Your Grace? Mr. Caulfield prodded. Indeed, Mr. Caulfield, it is so. And with that being so, I commit that I will take your proposal into consideration. I do believe the match would benefit us both. I am in need of a wife, and you are in need of a husband for your eldest daughter. So, if you believe that it would be a decent match, Mr. Caulfield, I consent to asking you for Miss Thea Caulfield's hand in marriage. As the look of sheer awe fell upon Mr. Caulfield's face, the Duke of Sandon felt a sinking sensation in his gut. The sensation of an unwise commitment that would have been better left undecided. Chapter 5. Thea, my dear, come speak with your mother and me, called her father. I shall tell you the rest later, but you mustn't leave before I finish. Thea instructed Delia, who was lying sprawled out on the bed, listening intently to Thea's story. Thea was explaining about a conversation she'd had with a bookshop keeper earlier in the day. Thea made her way to the door as Delia agreed to wait before going out to post her letter to another potential employer. Out of the bedroom and to her father's small study, Thea was surprised to find her parents both in such a serious attitude. She worried suddenly that something grave had happened to one of her brothers or even Georgette. "Papa?" she asked, before looking then to her mother. "Sit down, my girl," her father instructed. Thea did as she was told, but her wide green eyes continued to bounce between her parents. "Thea, my dear, how has your week been?" her father began. Thea became suspicious, unsure what this line of questioning had to do with the blank faces both her parents held. "It was the same as always, Papa. Why? What is all of this about? Mother?" she asked. Her mother turned away, seemingly aware that Thea would not like whatever was to come of this conversation. "Was it really a week like any other, Thea? Was there nothing different about it?" her father prodded. Thea realized exactly where this conversation was heading. He was trying to gauge her feelings about the Duke. For what reason? Why would her father even ask her what she thought of? And then, all at once, Thea realized. She would go to work for the Duke. Her father was asking about her feelings, and her parents had impressed upon the Duke about their daughter's work ethic at the dinner. Of course, how could she have been such a fool? Here, she and Delia were thinking their parents to be blind enough to consider themselves worthy of a duke for a husband to their daughter, when in reality, they were considering their daughter worthy of becoming his housekeeper. In a mixture of insult and relief, and utterly not wanting to go, Thea replied, "Well, Papa, you know I should like best to stay here with you, to look after you and keep you company. But I also know that the family must be supported, and I am to be a part of that." Mr. Caulfield seemed to light up at this response, as did his wife, who turned back to Thea, appraising her with appreciation. "So, you consent?" her father asked. Thea's eyes filled with tears. "I do not wish to be parted from you, Papa." She tried to finish her sentence to give her willingness, but she could only choke on her unexpected sobs. Mr. Caulfield came around the desk and drew her into his arms while her mother rested a hand on her shoulder. "We wish for nothing such as being parted from you, my darling, but this is best for our family and, truly, you will come to see in time that it is best for you," he assured her. "I know, Papa. And that is why I agree. I will work for the Duke if that is what you wish," she finally managed to say. The air in the room stilled, and Thea felt her mother's hand draw back quickly. Her father pulled away and looked at her with stern confusion. "Work?" he asked uncertainly. Thea blinked away her tears and looked between her two parents. "Well, yes, isn't that what we are speaking of? You wish for me to go and work for the Duke as a housekeeper," she stated. "I fear, Thea, that you have misunderstood our intentions," Mr. Caulfield said cautiously. "Then what could you possibly mean, Papa? First, Delia and I thought you and Mother wanted one of us to marry the Duke, but that is an impossibility. It must be that you wish for me to be employed by him," she reasoned. "Oh dear," her mother said, rushing from the room. "This is a conversation best had between father and daughter." Thea watched her mother exit before turning her eyes back to her father, who still had one arm around her. "My dear Thea, you and your sister were correct the first time around. It is my desire that you should marry the Duke of Sandon," her father explained. Another feeling settled in Thea. It was frustration. Why would her parents bother to call her in here to discuss something so unrealistic as this? Why were they even trying to consider it? Was it fair of them to raise their own hopes when it could never happen? "Papa, I ask you to be reasonable. You know as well as I that a nobleman cannot marry a commoner like me. It simply isn't done. Please, Papa, do not get Mother's hopes up so," she begged, speaking to her father as if he were an unreasonable child. It felt wrong, patronizing to speak to him thus, but she could not understand her father's words. Why would he think that the Duke would ever agree to this? "Thea, you do not understand me. It is already settled. This is not a mere hope or nonsensical dream. This is an agreement which I have made with the Duke himself. He has promised to allow this, to make it happen. He has assured me that he will have you for his wife," her father explained. Thea stared blankly at her father before a spurt of incredulous laughter escaped her lips. "Papa, you mean to tell me that you are being honest? That the Duke of Sandon has consented to marry me? That I am to be the wife of a nobleman for whom I feel nothing but pity for his arrogance and meaningless life?" she asked forthrightly. "Meaningless? Thea, what a terrible thing to say!" her father insisted. "Papa, do not make me do this," she begged. "You must, my dear. I promise you that you will be glad for it one day. The Duke will bring you a great fortune. You will be taken care of, looked after. You will want for nothing," her father insisted. "I shall want for you. I shall want for this life where I am your daughter and I am free. I shall want for the simplicity of our circumstances, where I am not paraded before fashionable society as a thing to behold. Please, Papa, please, do not make me marry him," she continued to plead. "I am sorry, Thea. I do this out of love for you and nothing else. I do this because I know it is what is best for you. I do believe that in time you will come to see that the Duke is a good man. He was willing to marry well beneath his station because he deems you worthy of that," her father added. "I'm sorry, Papa. I cannot stand this," Thea cried. Running from the room, she heard her father's voice as it called after her, while her mother rushed to follow her footsteps. But soon Thea was out of the house and through the small gate that protected their garden. She made her way onto the street and continued at her pace, however exhausted she was becoming. Soon Thea had made it to the other end of the crowded little town where her dear friend Miss Margaret Davidson lived. Thea knocked on the door and Margaret's mother, Mrs. Davidson, opened. "Thea, good heavens, what is it?" she said. "Forgive me, Mrs. Davidson, but is Margaret home? I must speak with her at once," Thea insisted. "Of course, but is everything all right?" she asked before immediately calling, "Margaret." "Yes, Mrs. Davidson. I simply need to speak with Margaret urgently," Thea said again. Coming down the stairs, Margaret appeared in her pale pink dress with her hair in golden ringlets. She had a petite face that framed an upturned nose, giving her a slightly piggish appearance. "Mother, what's it—" "Oh, goodness, Thea, are you sweating?" Margaret laughed as if in horror. "Margaret, please, come speak with me," she begged. Margaret's face mirrored her mother's with equal concern and anxiety. Thea grasped Margaret's arm and pulled her out the door. "Good heavens, Thea," Margaret said, sounding just like her mother. "Listen to what I have to say before you find yourself annoyed at me for urging you outside," Thea scolded. "All right, but don't keep me out here for long. The sun will cause me to freckle," Margaret complained. "Margaret, have you heard of the Duke of Sandon?" Thea asked. "Sandon? I don't know. Oh, wait. Is he the one who just built a new home on that piece of land that cost more than our entire town makes in a year?" Margaret asked. Thea rolled her eyes. "The very same." "What of him?" Margaret asked. "You'll not believe me, but I promise you it is the truth. The direst, most awful truth," Thea exclaimed. "Out with it then, Thea. None of these theatrics. Just tell me what on earth is so dire," Margaret demanded. "I'm to be married to him." Thea spoke flatly, suddenly frozen in place with her eyes locked on the blue sky fading into darkness in the west. By the sudden silence, she sensed that Margaret was dumbfounded or disbelieving. "Come now, Thea. This is not the sort of joke that will elicit a laugh from me," she warned. "If only it were a joke. But Margaret, it is the truth. My parents have already promised me to him, and I cannot for the life of me understand why he accepted," Thea said with a quiet sob. "I've not seen you in a week, Thea. I heard a nobleman came to town days ago to meet with some family. I had no idea that it was yours and would come to such a resolution," Margaret said, concerned. "I don't know. Perhaps I was ashamed. Ashamed that my father should let a man like that see our home. Ashamed that our neighbours might consider us to be the sort that seek wealth through connection. Ashamed that my father might desire me to marry a man so high above our station and embarrass himself when that great man refused. And yet, for some strange and unfathomable reason, the Duke accepted. He actually desired my hand, Margaret. Or maybe not desired, but saw some benefit in it. And what benefit could he possibly gain? Does he think he will be perceived as having acted upon some charity?" Thea wondered aloud. "Thea, this is an incredible thing that has happened to you," Margaret pointed out, seeming not to conceive how difficult it was for Thea. "Incredible. Margaret, he is arrogant. He looks down on us. Would you wish to be married to a man who looked down upon your family and your circumstances? I don't know what to do. I do not think I can marry him. I have to run away. Will you help me, please?" Thea begged. "Are you mad? Help you run away?" Margaret replied in surprise. "Of course, I know it won't be easy, but it is possible. Delia has been waiting here for an offer as a governess. But what if I go out on my own? What if I make my way and journey until I find some employment? Perhaps even as a housekeeper. I could do it. You know I could. I just need your help to arrange my transportation," Thea urged. "Thea, please," she pleaded desperately. "Thea," Margaret said calmly, "breathe. You ought not to stress yourself like this. I understand that you are upset. You're quite right. I shouldn't like to marry a man who looked down on me or my family either. But this is an amazing thing that has happened to you. You have an opportunity here, and you would be a fool to turn it down. It is time you consider marriage. It is time you consider what it would mean to your family and for your own future," Margaret said reasonably. Thea could not deny the truth of her friend's words. She had little choice in the matter. There was nothing more that could be done to prevent what had already been arranged. Thea would have to marry the Duke of Sandon. Chapter 6. "You seem in a different mood today, son," the Duke of Sandon's mother noted as she sipped her sherry in the parlour. "Indeed, mother, I am," the Duke of Sandon replied. "Did I tell you that we have finalised the majority of the furnishings for the new home?" "No, you did not. I suppose I'm unlikely to ever be invited over for a visit," she said woundedly. Of course you shall, Mother. But you do keep insisting that I must take a wife, and I should like her to have a home of her own making rather than one made by my mother, he reminded her. Oh, poppycock. It is well known by now that you shall take no wife. You continue to tease me so, assuring me that the season is coming and you will find a wife then. I do not trust you any more, son. If you were going to find a wife, you would have by now. All the eligible young ladies have gone off and married. I know of none of our rank who have a daughter coming into society this season, she complained. The Duke of Sandon smirked to himself, delighted that she was already worked up. Then surely, Mother, you will not believe me when I tell you that I have made an advance, that I have spoken to and made arrangements with a gentleman to marry his daughter and make her my wife, he teased. His mother set the sherry on the table beside her cushioned chair. Do not tease me so, son. You know I do not take kindly to it, she warned. I am not teasing you, Mother. It is true. I have asked the young woman's father and he has approved. We are to be married, although there are still a great many details to discuss, he added. Oh, my goodness, his mother said, clutching at her chest, as if she might keel over there and then. Do you mean to tell me it is true, then? You are finally intending to marry? Indeed, Mother. I am soon to marry, the Duke of Sandon confirmed, thinking about the beautiful but otherwise unimpressive Miss Caulfield. Oh dear, do tell me about her. What sort of young woman is she? Beautiful, I expect. And her father, who is he? Someone from the club? Or one of your gentlemen's societies? She prodded. Oh no, Mother, nothing of the sort, he said casually. Nothing of the sort? She asked in bewilderment. What do you mean by that? What does nothing of the sort mean? It means that I did not meet him at any gentleman's club or society, the Duke of Sandon replied, drawing out the confession until his mother was already at her wits' end. This would be worth every agonizing moment. No matter how he longed to see her shock and horror, the Duke of Sandon was frustrated beyond the telling of it and wanted her to rage at his spitefulness. A sense of shame flooded the Duke of Sandon's breast. He had made this decision to wound his mother and might end up paying the consequences, or worse, forcing Miss Caulfield and her family to suffer as a result. But he could not bear his mother's nagging any longer. The Duke of Sandon had met women of good breeding who behaved worse than those of a lower class. Why should breeding determine who a man could and could not marry? Then where might I finally be privileged to know? Did you meet him? She asked forcefully. Why, Mother, he is the merchant who has been helping me to furnish our new estate, the Duke of Sandon replied nonchalantly. He watched his mother's mouth drop, saw the shock and horror he had longed for. He both relished and regretted it. He felt justified and ashamed in the same moment, but he pushed his conscience aside and allowed her to gasp in disbelief. You mean to tell me that you have made the choice to marry the daughter of a merchant? She demanded. Well, Mother, you did insist that I wed. You never said anything about the station she had to be from, he defended mockingly, as if he hadn't known all along what she really wanted and expected from him. I never imagined you could be so hateful, she spat. Do you really think so little of your station that this amuses you? Do you think so little of me that you imagined I would not mind the fact that you want to wound me so? Oh, Mother, you do not seem to understand that this decision was to fulfill exactly what you wished for me. Did you not insist that I find a wife? Better yet, she is a beautiful young woman to behold, he reminded her. His mother would not look at him. Well then, if you are unhappy with my fulfilling a promise to you, then I suppose there is nothing I can do about it, he said, remaining casual and cheerless. The Duke of Sandon knew his mother had every reason to be angry, but he also hoped she would feel the anger and rage that he had felt at every turn when she had pushed him to this. His mother turned her face away from him, and the Duke of Sandon decided that, as it was still early enough in the evening, he might go visit his friend, the Duke of Arbershire. He called to one of the footmen to ready the coach for him. He arrived at his friend's home in just half an hour, and William greeted him heartily. Duke, how are you? He asked with a wide smile. Very well, Duke, the Duke of Sandon replied to his equal in status friend. The Duke of Sandon was ushered into William's study, where the housekeeper brought them each a glass of brandy with more in a glass decanter. The two men sat for a while beside the fire and settled in. Now then, what is it that you wanted to discuss? I'm quite certain you are not here to practice fencing, or that ought to have happened before we started on the brandy, William laughed. No, no indeed. I have another matter to discuss with you, the Duke of Sandon began. Oh? That man, Mr. Caulfield, what do you think of him? The Duke of Sandon asked. What do I think of him? William scoffed. Well, I hardly know him. I met the man only once or twice. It was my wife who insisted on furnishing our home. You know she cares nothing for my tastes, he added bitterly. The Duke of Sandon felt the same sinking sensation in his gut. Yes, I know that wives rarely care for the tastes of their husbands. So why do you ask about him? William prodded. The Duke of Sandon took a deep breath in. Because I am to marry his daughter, he said in a slow, staccato manner. William choked on his brandy and coughed while the Duke of Sandon blandly clapped him on the back a few times. I know, he said with a sigh. I am mad for thinking this is a sensible solution to my mother's incessant pushing. But in truth, I've never met a woman whom I care for. Ever. And perhaps that means there is something wrong with me, or perhaps it means that love does not exist. We simply must choose a woman and make it work. You, Joseph Tyndale, the Duke of Sandon, are marrying a merchant's daughter? William asked incredulously before he burst out in laughter. Oh, this is too rich, or should I say it is too poor. My goodness, man. Yes, I know, the Duke of Sandon said again. Once William had calmed himself, the Duke of Sandon told him how it all came about. While he felt guilty and ashamed for doing it to spite his mother, he had resigned himself to the fact that he must be married anyway. At least this way he was helping the family of a man he respected. A man you respect? Perhaps, but he is still just a commoner, William pointed out. And why should common men not be allowed small graces now and then? Why should their daughters not be honoured also? He asked. Honoured? You did not agree to this marriage to honour her. You are dishonouring her by marrying her for no other reason than to spite your mother. Do not speak to me of any honour in the marriage. Duke, William said, adding the last to make a point that he was trying to remain reverent when he felt little respect for his friend in that moment. The Duke of Sandon hung his head, knowing that William was entirely right. He had been a fool and had acted cruelly, but no matter what mess he had made of it all, he was committed now, and he would have to follow through with that commitment. They remained quiet for a time before William spoke again. By the way, I had intended to speak with you regarding another matter, he began. Oh, and what's that? The Duke of Sandon asked, taking a long swig of the brandy. Seeing as how you're now marrying into merchant families, I am even more inclined to share the idea with you, William jabbed. But I've heard about a new trade opportunity. Perhaps you might even get your father-in-law involved. He could trade some of his fabrics and you could trade a great deal more. Trade? You think that will bring good returns? Don't get me wrong, I know the global economy is shrinking every day, but I have never been involved in international trade, the Duke of Sandon pointed out. Well, now is the time. Your family has undue wealth, and it is a small risk for you. I've nearly doubled my income over the past 3 months through this trade in the Orient. It is a sound investment, William promised. The Duke of Sandon was intrigued. He knew nothing of furnishing a home, but tradesmen and business? He knew many men who had grown wealthy being involved in this. Some brought in food products, others fabrics, which truly would be an excellent opportunity for the Caulfields. It sounded like a clever idea. He pushed William for more details, realizing that this could be just the thing to appease his mother in the midst of her anger. It was certainly an option. If he could double their income and increase their wealth, she would have no more reason to hate him, despite the scandal of choosing to marry a woman so far beneath his station. The Duke of Sandon returned to his home that night with his mind full. He had made two enormous decisions that day: to marry Miss Caulfield, whom he knew he ought to speak with and get to know, and to become involved with trade. He found himself exhausted by the end of the night, but despite that, he allowed himself to focus his thoughts on remembering every detail he could of his future bride. The first was easy enough. Miss Caulfield was beautiful. She had thick, dark hair and green eyes the colour of deep moss. Her face was shaped like a heart, and her lips were full at the end of a long, straight nose. Her father had claimed she was clever, although most fathers thought that of their daughters. Whether or not she had any real wit he would determine later, and she had felt threatened when she interpreted his words as mocking her mother. He realised that his patronising attitude had come out in a way he hadn't expected, and she noted it indisputably. The Duke of Sandon thought he might not grow to like her, but so long as she was not as intolerable as his mother, he could at least live with her. Chapter 7. Thea woke early, understanding that the day would be monumental for her parents. Not only was the marriage to be announced in society, but Thea's father had arranged for her and the Duke of Sandon to share a chaperoned walk around a park in Cambridge, which would put them in full view of the public. A new dress had been made specifically for the occasion. Thea looked at it grimly when it came time for her to dress. Could she really bring herself to walk amongst all the men and women of fashionable society? Would she manage to fool them into believing that she belonged? After all, Thea could stand strong and tall, but that did not mean that she could pretend to be as important as the man she would be walking with. Once she was seen out and about with the Duke of Sandon, would anyone be willing to leave her be? What if they came to see her as a means to the Duke? Thea didn't know if she was overthinking or if these were legitimate concerns. It was certainly possible that she would not be seen for her own merit, but what if she was overlooked entirely? Scoffing at herself for worrying about these things, Thea focused instead on harshly brushing her hair. Each stroke was pulling through the anger she still clung to. "Thea," came Delia's voice. "Yes?" she asked in reply. "Mum says it is time for you to be ready downstairs. The Duke of Sandon shall be here presently," Delia informed her. "And how is Mother to know that with any certainty?" Thea grumbled in complaint. Delia looked at her mournfully before sitting at the edge of the bed. "I know you are unhappy, but honestly, Thea, Mother and Father are thrilled, and you have found a position not possible for most of us," Delia reasoned. "Then why don't you marry him?" Thea asked angrily as the tears rushed to her eyes. She swiped at them, not wanting her sister to see the sadness that lay beneath her rage. "I would if he had chosen me," Delia said in a quiet voice. Thea's head snapped up in surprise. "You would?" she asked. Delia was slow to answer, and Thea saw that she was forming her thoughts. "It is not as if I love him any more than you do," Delia began. "But life for us is not easy, Thea. You know this as well as I. Life is not easy for us, but it can be made better. And having a match like yours to the Duke, that is a blessing. I only wish that you could see it." Thea felt ashamed. Her sister was right in many ways, but she still could not get herself to believe that it was entirely true. The Duke of Sandon was still the same man she had seen that evening when he came to dinner. That man who couldn't even handle the dust on his shoes from their dwelling. "Would you rather struggle for work as I have?" Delia asked. Thea looked at her blankly, knowing that if she had begun searching for work when Delia had, she might have avoided this altogether. "You would marry a man you did not know?" she asked Delia. "I would marry freedom from the struggles that women face. I would marry security, and I would marry the relief of knowing I was no longer a burden to my family," Delia answered honestly. Thea looked away but stood up to make her way down the stairs. Before exiting the room, she turned to her sister. "I shall try my hardest to have your optimism. I shall make an effort to view the Duke in the way that you would," Thea promised. With that, she left her sister and descended the stairs until she was in what passed for a drawing room in their small house. Her mother was already sitting, staring out the window for the first glimpse of the Duke of Sandon. "Oh, girl, I am glad you have finally come. He must be here so— Oh, there he is!" Mrs. Caulfield exclaimed. Thea inhaled deeply, suddenly very nervous for the walk ahead now that she had made such a promise to Delia. Her mother insisted they wait patiently in the room until the Duke of Sandon came in to greet them. "Mrs. Caulfield, it is lovely to see you again," the Duke greeted. Thea's mother seemed to swoon a little once again at seeing the strong, wealthy young man. "And you as well, Your Grace. We are honoured to have you in our home once more," she finally replied. "And Miss Caulfield," he said, turning to Thea, "I am pleased we shall have this time to spend with one another ahead of our nuptials." Thea stared at the Duke for a moment, trying to remember that this tall man with the brown hair and the deep brown eyes, with the perfectly tailored coat and the shoes that appeared to have a permanent shine, was going to be her husband soon. What had she promised Delia again? And I, Your Grace. I am glad for our walk," she replied hesitantly. Thea could not understand why now, in this moment, her nerves had shifted so. All thought of what others would say about her as the Duke's poor wife vanished. She was suddenly very frightened that they might find nothing at all to talk about, or that she would utterly disappoint him, making herself a humiliation should he call off the wedding. Indeed, they could not go back now. She had to be what he expected of her. "Ah, Annie," Mrs. Caulfield said. "Your Grace, this is my daughter's chaperone, Miss Sexton. She shall accompany you on the walk." "Miss Sexton," the Duke greeted, and the young woman curtsied in return. "Well then, shall we?" the Duke suggested, ushering Thea through the door of the home. Once they were in the coach, Thea felt her heart pounding a little more intensely, as she now had to make small talk with the Duke, knowing that it would be heard by her chaperone. She was entirely grateful when he began the conversation before she was forced to. "Miss Caulfield, is a walk to your taste?" he inquired. Thea had not anticipated him asking her preferences on activities, but was thankful that he was making the effort to find out if he had suggested the right thing for their time together. "Indeed, Your Grace, I am rather fond of walking. I enjoy any activity that allows me to take in the air," she answered. "That is good to know. And what other activities do you enjoy? Riding? Or perhaps sewing and pianoforte?" he pressed. Thea knew that there were things expected of young women that she ought to try and conform to, but at the same time, she did not wish to pretend to be something other than herself. "I have little experience riding, I'm afraid. When I was young, my uncle had a horse, and we were able to ride with my father, but I've had no such opportunity since," Thea replied. "I do sew quite well, and I enjoy the luxury of my father's fabrics. I've no experience with the pianoforte, but I do have a love for reading." She tried to think of anything special that she enjoyed, but nothing came to mind. The Duke of Sandon smiled at her answer, and she realized she needed to ask the same question of him. "Oh, and you, Your Grace, what is it that you enjoy?" she asked. Just then, the coach came to a stop, and the coachman came around to open the door. Thea exited and saw the beautiful landscape of the park they would walk. There were hundreds of other people spread throughout the expanse. They would be seen quite openly. Once they were ready to begin, the Duke of Sandon addressed Thea's question. "I am also a lover of reading. I should think you will enjoy the library in my new home. Our new home, rather, once I have the shelves filled with my private collection," he told her. Thea was unsure if he was trying to comfort her or impress her. If he was being haughty and bragging about his collection, she would be hesitant to give him the satisfaction of being impressed. "And I do greatly enjoy fencing," he continued. "Having never been in any sort of real sword fight, I cannot help but enjoy it." He added this last part with a gentle laugh, and Thea wondered why any man should enjoy pretending to stab another. However, she also realized that she was being unreasonable again. She had to give the Duke of Sandon an opportunity to share about himself without judgment. "That sounds quite interesting," she replied, trying to believe her own words. "Yes, well, it is only a bit of sport," the Duke of Sandon reasoned. Thea noticed that they were being watched with every step. Miss Sexton was a few paces behind, but it was all the others who noticed this merchant's daughter with a powerful duke, and seemed utterly repulsed by her presence among them. Thea ignored it and rather tried to focus on the Duke. "Might I say, Miss Caulfield, that I am rather surprised by you?" he then said suddenly. Thea stopped walking for a moment and stared at him. The Duke of Sandon stopped as well and turned to her. "Forgive me," she said, then began walking again. "I do not need to forgive anything. I am surprised by you because of your honesty. It is not like the majority of the young women I have met in society to be so honest. I find you to be rather refreshing," he complimented with a smile. Thea felt as if something were rolling in her chest into the pit of her stomach. She had not anticipated anything like this from the Duke. They walked around the park, maintaining a good deal of quiet, before the Duke suggested he ought to get Thea back to her home. The coach was silent, but Thea's mind was troubled by confusion. As she watched out the window, she discreetly observed him, curious as to his thoughts. Later that evening, Margaret came to visit Thea in the parlour and learn how the day had gone. "Well, he was different than I had anticipated," Thea confessed. "Oh, was he charming and utterly sincere?" Margaret asked romantically. "No," Thea laughed. "Perhaps in some ways he was rather complimentary, but I also cannot say that we have any similar interests, save for reading and walking, but those do not make a marriage. And we spoke very little. In fact, after he told me how he appreciated my honesty, I can't say that we spoke of anything further." "Just give it time, Thea. It seems to me that you are the only person opposed to this match. Do you not think there is a reason?" Margaret asked. "Perhaps there is, but I cannot see it," Thea replied. Her mind twisted with the fact that she needed to accept the marriage. But could she truly let go of everything she had ever hoped for in her life? Chapter 8. "Mr. Cotswold, I presume?" the Duke greeted as he sat in the chair on the other side of the desk in the office. "Indeed, and it is a pleasure to meet you, Your Grace," replied the businessman as he sat in his own chair. Mr. Cotswold leaned back and seemed to be appraising the Duke of Sandon. It left him feeling uneasy, as if he were being judged by how much Mr. Cotswold could expect from him financially. After a moment of intense quiet, the Duke of Sandon finally spoke. "I do believe you know why I've come," he said, as if it were a question. "Indeed," Mr. Cotswold replied, leaning forward. "Our mutual friend has told me that you are interested in starting up with a trade firm." "Well, it has been recommended to me. I was rather hoping that you might help to advise me in the matter," the Duke said, wondering if Mr. Cotswold was, indeed, a trade advisor, or rather a man who simply made a profit on advising men to move forward. "I see. In truth, Your Grace, I cannot advise you on what is best for your family. I can only tell you what options you have and encourage you to think through them critically before following through," Mr. Cotswold said in response. "Which I do appreciate," the Duke replied. "But what might you be able to tell me about your business?" "My firm is growing rapidly. We have 3 ships on the sea, each one bringing commodities that are of great value to the English people. With every item traded, Britain learns of a new toy that it simply cannot live without." Mr. Cotswold smiled in a rather charming, wistful way. "I imagine so. Tell me then, do you not trade simply in typical goods, such as spices and the like?" the Duke inquired. "We certainly trade in such important materials as those as well. However, we do like to broaden our goods. Have a look at this," Mr. Cotswold said, pulling a wooden box out of his drawer. The Duke of Sandon looked at it, uncertain what made it different from other wooden boxes, save for a glance of the beautiful design carved upon it. Then he noticed that inlaid into the wood was a colourful array of polished stones and even the white of bone, creating an image of an oriental garden. "It is exquisite," the Duke commented, incredulous. "Yes, indeed, it is. However, that is not the extent of it," the tradesman noted. He offered it to the Duke to try, and he quickly realised that the lid would not open. Looking back at Mr. Cotswold, he waited. "Let me show you," Mr. Cotswold offered, taking the box and moving a number of small pieces to reveal a hidden opening from which a small metal key dropped. Mr. Cotswold moved one more piece of wood and allowed the Duke to open the puzzle box. "It is marvellous," the Duke exclaimed. "It most certainly is, and I must tell you, this is from nearer regions than those to which we will be travelling. Such creativity only deepens the further into a society we travel. You will see. You will know for yourself very soon that this is the way of the future," Mr. Cotswold assured him. "It is only for you to decide whether or not you shall move forward with us." The Duke of Sandon was still for a moment, considering this. Surely, he considered, that Mr. Cotswold was being genuine if he was encouraging him to make his own decisions, encouraging him to see the crafts available. If he was intent on allowing the Duke to choose what he quite desired, then the man must be trustworthy. However, the Duke of Sandon was no fool. He would not make his decisions that day, but truly would take time and also learn more about Mr. Cotswold and his character before investing in this trade opportunity. "Well then," the Duke began, "I appreciate the information you have given me. I do have much to consider and would like to take the opportunity to make some decisions." Mr. Cotswold's smile faltered for only an instant. "Have you no further questions?" he asked. "Quite a few, actually. However, I still must consider whether or not trade is even the right path to choose," the Duke answered. "And how will you make that determination without answers?" Mr. Cotswold reasoned, with a legitimate truth to keep the Duke present. The Duke of Sandon sighed. "I understand that you're correct, but I also do not know if it is wise to risk my family's wealth in this endeavour at all," he replied. Mr. Cotswold leaned forward again and pressed his hands together. "Your Grace, you do have much to think about. But I can guarantee you that investing in a trade business and being a part of a company that will be bringing the finest quality items from the Orient is the wisest financial decision a man can make in our times. Trade is the future. Fabrics, tea, inventions you have never imagined possible. All of them are now at our fingertips because of trade. They are inexpensive to purchase and transport, and they bring in a significant revenue from those to whom they are sold," Mr. Cotswold said passionately. "And how much would I be expected to invest into this new business?" the Duke asked. Mr. Cotswold continued his variations by leaning back. "Well now, Your Grace, that is not the matter at hand. It is only a very small sum required, and any beyond that is accepted only so long as it is at your comfort," the man replied, offended that it should even be a consideration. The Duke's face fell. He was still hesitant. Mr. Cotswold did not seem entirely honest so far as he could tell. "I suppose you are right, Your Grace," Mr. Cotswold said suddenly, standing from his chair. "Perhaps you are not the man for this particular trade investment. You have doubts, and a man who harbours doubts cannot hold to this business. Besides, I have another appointment with Lord Engsbury. I understand and respect if you cannot hold to this venture. There are dozens of men interested, but of course I wish to give you favour because of our mutual friend. Please do not worry. I should hate for you to feel obligated," Mr. Cotswold explained. "Oh, I was not aware there was so much interest," the Duke of Sandon said aloud. "Forgive me. I believed there was time to consider and invest when that time came." "Well, we do try to give men opportunities to do so, but I also cannot help it when I have so many interested parties. And while there are others wishing for an appointment, Lord Engsbury is the only other with whom I have scheduled on account of his being involved with another trade expedition," Mr. Cotswold divulged. "I see. He has experience, then?" the Duke of Sandon asked. "Of course, and I know he is a man with that distinct courage that will take my business far," Mr. Cotswold replied. The Duke of Sandon considered. He longed to be a brave man, the sort who was willing to take risks to better his life and that of his family. And soon he would be married. He would take a wife who would need to be provided for. Beyond that, in the future someday, he might have children as a result. It would do a great deal of good for them to have so much financial security. Right then, if that is the case, I suppose we ought to continue the discussion. When the Duke of Sandon arrived home that evening, he felt a sense of pride. He had indeed been brave. taking a risk and investing in something that he had never looked into before was not what he would have advised for others. But he was feeling confident. And if his friend, the Duke of Arbershire, had done as well as he claimed, then there was no reason not to trust him. It had merely been a matter of anxiety and uncertainty about Mr. Cotswold that caused him to hesitate so much. But after the appointment, he had gone to the Duke of Arbishire's home, where his friend confirmed that while Mr. Cotswold was utterly unlikable, he was an excellent man and a great deal better than he seemed at first meeting. The Duke of Sandon sat in his study, as he typically did in the evenings. Placing papers in neat stacks, he arranged the new business account and considered what goods he would see brought from the Orient in return for his decision. Perhaps, if he was able to give his mother a nice trinket, she would be appeased about his marrying well below his station. She was a woman who desired to have things that others in society would never have. The Duke was certain he could come up with something. Should he truly manage to triple his family's money, he could not imagine what awaited them. He would be able to lavish his new bride with gifts, if for no other reason than to put on a show that they loved one another. He would also be able to build another estate, and if he were fortunate enough to have sons one day, he might be able to ensure each was cared for. As the Duke of Sandon dreamt about these things, conceiving what he might do with the fortune he saw in the near future, his spirits only lightened further. He thought again about the puzzle box and how he ought to have one brought for his mother. She would like that. It would be a place to keep some of her finer jewels for when she did not wear them. And perhaps he might fetch one for Miss Caulfield as well. She had seemed rather honest, but also quite private on their walk. He thought that perhaps she was just the sort of woman who might need a box in which to keep things hidden. Their wedding would not be long from then. The Duke considered that it would be quite a good idea to have a puzzle box in time for that, perhaps even left in her room after the ceremony, and he could show her how to use it if she liked. It felt strange to think of the young woman. It was as if, despite knowing they were to be married, he had to remind himself just to remember her. By not knowing her at all, he found it so easy to forget her completely. What sort of husband would he make, forgetting his wife in the day-to-day of things?
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.